In our next chapter, we want to talk about continuous integration pipelines. And to make the buzzwords to make us fully buzzword compliant, it is the introduction to CI/CD pipelines. What's that? Continuous integration, continuous delivery, or continuous deployment. What does that mean? Well, now that we have set up our very first Docker images and containers, you are already aware of the mechanics to turn the delivered Liferay, jar file, zip file, all the bundles or the WAR file into your application server and have it run. That's only one part of the job, because most likely you will have your own custom plugins, if only the theme, because you want your portal to look like yours, not like ours. And then there's patches that Liferay delivers for your installation. And then there's more modules, more custom modules that you require, and more custom configuration that you require. Everything needs to go into your running system. And during the break, when we haven't recorded, we have already discussed how should we build our production system as opposed to our test systems. And that's precisely what we can talk about in the continuous integration, continuous deployment build cycle or life cycle. Number one, I'll just cover the benefits here that we have here. As it says, bugs are caught earlier, making them easier and cheaper to fix. What does that mean? Well, if you have a bug in your Docker file, if you make any mistake in packaging everything, there is no way to go into the system and manually fix it until the next deployment, and then you'll run into the same things again. You gotta deploy a correct Docker image and run it as the container. Then you'll have a reproducible build, which means you'll always build from the same source. You'll always build on the same server, not on some developer server where they have updated some dependencies on their own. You're always building, for example, with Jenkins or with any other build server, with any other configuration management system that you have. You will be able to store all of the previous images, which means a rollback to the previous image that you have deployed will be trivial because you still have it around. If not the image, which is large, you have the diff of all the build instructions, which is, after all, just a Docker file, the Docker compose file, and that's quite trivial. And last but not least, you have everything there. As soon as the build server is done, you can deploy, or you're waiting. Everything is ready when you want to deploy it. Now, in terms of continuous integration, there's something else. There's not just the deployment to production, there is to make sure that you deploy the correct version in production and a working version in production, which means your build server most likely will run some automated tests. And these tests will run. If the tests don't run, no image will be created, and that's actually what you want. Because, hey, it's certified to not work. Why would you want to deploy it in production? That's number one. You have unit tests, you have integration tests, and you have the functional tests. Unfortunately, you got to implement them on your own, most likely, because, well, we are running a lot of functional tests, integration tests, and unit tests before we build the deliverables that we deliver to you. However, you will have to make sure that your own modifications to Liferay's core, your own modules on top of Liferay will still run. And that's what these unit tests, integration tests, and functional tests are for. And then we'll have the two continuous deployment and continuous delivery. Once you have built your images, once your tests are running, you want to determine where do you actually deploy your systems to, or your images to production, to your test system, user acceptance test, to your developers. Where do you deploy them to, and when do you deploy them? First of all, the continuous deployment means you can at any time update any system that you want. And you will know what happens in between the two states. You can deploy the same image to user acceptance test as well as to your production environment, to your backup environment, anywhere. And typically, when you use continuous deployment, you will have a marker, you will have the commit ID of your specific image that you want to deploy somewhere. So you can say, well, I have the very latest image, but I know that 3 images ago, this was a commit that actually worked, and we're now testing the rest. But on production, I'm going to deploy my image from 3 builds ago. They will all have a unique ID, and then you can deploy that one. Pushing into production says here, with a full chain of safeguards and tests that ensure quality, predictability, and repeatability. Now that's a mouthful of lots of buzzwords, but that's exactly what you want. So if you have something reproducible and you want to deploy that in production, go ahead. Now the topics that we talked about here in the room before or in between of all of the recordings are: how do I deal with all of these deployments? What do I deploy in testing? What do I deploy in production? And will those be the same images or not? And as far as I'm concerned, I would say they are not necessarily exactly the same images, but they can differ in various ways. For example, in our Wildfly example, you have seen that our Wildfly simulation that we've used here depends on fake SMTP. So you have deployed a version that uses a mail server that does not send out any mail to any customer. That's typically a good thing if you run in a test environment. That's a very bad thing if you run in a production environment. But if I have the choice, I'd rather err on the side of safety. So I'd rather not send a mail, because that can be fixed, and then later on I can say, oh, something went wrong with the mail configuration, than the other way around, sending out lots of test messages to my customers or to the intranet. That assumes you're accessing production data in your test system and have live user accounts in your test system. Bad thing, but it happens. So, do you deploy the same image on test and production environments? I would say no, they can differ slightly. They have the same root in the same image, and then change a couple of configurations. For example, just the mail server. Just make sure that your test server does never connect to any production database. Make sure that the mail server that you configure is a very specific one. Have some configurations that are unique to your test environment, to your load test environment, to your production environment. That's where these images differ, but they always come from a certain common root, common ancestor, common image that you built for yourself, where you know these are my versions of my own plugins, these are Liferay's versions, service packs, fix packs, hot fixes, and they all together make my root image, and then I'll just vary a couple of configurations for the various environments. And yes, they will be different. You will never have tested your production image in a pre-production environment, but you can easily see the diff and see, yeah, this is the mail server and this is the mail server, this is the database server, this is the database server. That's trivial, and that is something that you can actually use, that you can actually test through review rather than through actually running in that environment. That being said, this is a very theoretical construct, rather theoretical chapter. Is there anything that, well, I can point to people on video? Is there anything that you want to add? Then please add it on the side of the video to the comments, or I can ask the people in the room if they have something to add, their own experiences. Are you using Jenkins? Are you using a different product to build? Or is there anything that I have missed?
Our configuration files outside the container, so the image will be the same. But some administration won't allow this, so we have to do this like you said, but it is predictable, so we are safe to deliver this on production.
Mm-hmm. So basically you have another volume for configuration files, and they are external to the image.
And they are always prepared, so we are safe to deliver this. especially for the license, for the different licenses, for the different stages like QA, acceptance testing, and so on.
Right, that's a good point, because in Liferay DXP we'll need the activation key, and the activation key in production is definitely different than the key in any pre-production test environments. Yes, they are fixed, and this is another variation that you can have in between the different images, the image that you run in pre-production and the image that you run in production, definitely. Yes, it's I wouldn't say dangerous, but you got to be aware when you have your configuration files outside of your image, that quickly goes into non-reproducible images, because you'll have an image that is not tied to its configuration. So having the configuration files in a separate volume means they can be changed independent of the image and independent of what you actually test in your test environment. So yes, it's good to have that, because you're very flexible. That's a positive, and that's also a negative. You're very flexible. You can just change something that you've never seen in the other environment. You can quick fix something without any trace in the configuration management system, because you can just change the files.
The benefit is that the images are the same, so we can make it be assured that this is the same. Yeah. And it's always when you lose something, you gain something.
Yeah, it's positive and it's negative, both at the same time. Yes,
configuration files were very small, so changes won't happen on there.
Yeah. And you can, of course, have them in your own configuration management system as well. And that's precisely the beauty. That's why I wanted to have people here to protest and say, no, we'll do it differently. Because, yeah, there's no right or wrong. There's just an according to policy and not according to policy. And which policy is that? Mine, yours, somebody else's? That's the variation. Good. Thank you. That concludes the CI/CD chapter. I'll see you on the other side of these next chapters. There's no exercise here.